If you disconnect this call, officer, you'll remember this moment for the rest of your life." The words were calm, steady, and almost impossibly gentle, yet they settled over the crowded terminal with a weight that silenced even the background chatter for a heartbeat. Brigadier General Naomi Brooks stood beside a row of polished steel benches inside the military section of Reagan National Airport, her wrists secured in front of her with standard police restraints while travelers slowed their pace, phones quietly appearing in their hands one after another. A rolling suitcase rested upright beside her polished black shoes, its military luggage tag swaying slightly beneath the cool draft from the overhead ventilation. She wore no uniform, only a charcoal blazer over a navy blouse, comfortable slacks, and the simple silver watch that had accompanied her through more years of service than anyone standing around her could possibly imagine. To nearly everyone watching, she looked like an ordinary middle-aged black woman caught in an unfortunate confrontation. To officers Ethan Collins and Mark Sullivan, she looked like someone who had made an unbelievable claim. Collins held Naomi's phone just beyond her reach, the screen still glowing with an unfinished call. His expression carried the quiet certainty of someone convinced experience had already answered every question before it had been asked. "Nobody at the Pentagon is waiting for you," he said evenly, slipping the phone into one hand while keeping his attention fixed on her face. "You can clear this up downtown." Naomi met his eyes without raising her voice. There was no panic in her breathing, no anger tightening her jaw, only an unexpected sadness that seemed older than the moment itself. Around them, the polished marble floor reflected the bright afternoon sunlight pouring through enormous glass windows overlooking the runway. Outside, a transport aircraft taxied slowly across the concrete, its engines humming like distant thunder beneath a cloudless Virginia sky. A young Army private standing several yards away shifted nervously, his duffel bag hanging from one shoulder. Twice he opened his mouth as though he wanted to speak. Twice he stopped himself after noticing Collins' glance in his direction. The private lowered his eyes, uncertainty replacing confidence. Near the security checkpoint, whispers moved faster than footsteps. Some travelers assumed Naomi had tried to enter a restricted area. Others guessed she had presented fake credentials. Nobody actually knew. They only saw handcuffs. They only saw uniforms. They only saw a woman standing perfectly still while authority surrounded her. Collins glanced at the identification card clipped inside a transparent evidence sleeve. The photograph matched her face. The name read Naomi Brooks. The rank displayed Brigadier General. He gave a short, skeptical smile before looking toward Sullivan. "Nice counterfeit," he muttered. Sullivan shrugged as if the conclusion required no further discussion. Naomi slowly inhaled the cool, recycled air filling the terminal. She remembered another airport decades earlier, another day when her father had quietly squeezed her shoulder before her first military academy interview. "People won't always recognize your worth," he had told her. "Never let their opinion decide your character." The memory arrived with surprising clarity, carrying the scent of old leather luggage and fresh coffee, as though the years between had folded into a single breath. Collins removed the phone from his pocket once more as it vibrated. The screen illuminated again with an incoming call. He frowned briefly, looked at the unfamiliar government number flashing across the display, and without hesitation pressed the red button. The call disappeared. Naomi closed her eyes for only a fraction of a second. When she opened them again, she quietly said, "Officer, that was your last chance to let this end differently." 25 minutes earlier, the afternoon had felt almost ordinary. Sunlight poured across the airport terminal, warming the wide glass walls overlooking the runways where aircraft climbed into the clear Virginia sky every few minutes. Brigadier General Naomi Brooks stepped through the sliding entrance carrying a weathered black carry-on that had traveled with her through nearly every assignment of her 30-year military career. The wheels rolled softly across the polished floor, and the small American flag attached to the zipper moved gently with each step. Dressed in civilian clothes instead of her dress uniform, she blended easily into the steady flow of families, service members, business travelers, and airport employees rushing toward departure gates. She preferred it that way. Recognition had never been the reason she served. Her phone vibrated quietly. The message came from Walter Brooks, her older brother. Their mother had finished another medical treatment that morning and was resting comfortably at the rehabilitation center outside Arlington. Naomi smiled to herself before typing a short reply promising she would arrive before dinner. She had spent months overseas coordinating humanitarian logistics alongside military operations, and now all she wanted was to sit beside her mother, hold her hand, and listen to stories she had heard since childhood without interrupting once. As Naomi approached the military transportation desk, a young Army private noticed the identification badge hanging inside her blazer. His eyes widened slightly before he straightened his posture. He looked barely 20 years old, his new uniform still carrying the crisp appearance of recent graduation. He hesitated for a second before walking toward her. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "the shuttle assigned for visiting senior officers will be here in about 10 minutes. Naomi thanked him with the same quiet warmth she offered everyone regardless of rank. "Take care of your feet," she added with a small smile. "They will carry you farther than ambition ever can." The private laughed softly, clearly surprised by the advice. Before he could answer, another traveler accidentally dropped a folder filled with paperwork. Pages scattered across the polished floor like white leaves caught in a breeze. Naomi immediately knelt to help gather them, handing each sheet back with patient care until every page was safely stacked again. The grateful traveler thanked her several times, never realizing he had just met one of the highest-ranking officers in the building. Naomi never corrected him. Kindness did not require introductions. Across the terminal, Officer Ethan Collins observed the exchange while finishing a conversation with Sergeant Mark Sullivan. Collins had worked airport security long enough to believe he could recognize deception almost instantly. Experience had sharpened his confidence, but over time confidence had quietly become certainty. His attention settled on the military identification clipped inside Naomi's blazer. Something about the combination of casual clothing and an exceptionally high military rank immediately caught his attention. He narrowed his eyes and watched as she spoke calmly with the young private, who stood respectfully while listening. Collins folded his arms. "That does not look right," he muttered. Sullivan glanced over without much interest at first, then focused on the identification badge. "A brigadier general traveling alone without an escort," he replied. Collins nodded slowly. "Exactly." Neither man noticed the government sedan waiting outside beyond the terminal entrance, its driver occasionally checking his watch while expecting a distinguished passenger who had not yet appeared. Neither officer realized that within a few minutes, a routine afternoon would begin unraveling in ways neither of them could have imagined. Officer Ethan Collins walked toward Naomi with the measured confidence of someone who believed every unusual situation had a simple explanation waiting beneath the surface. Sergeant Mark Sullivan followed half a step behind, his polished badge catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the towering airport windows. Around them, rolling suitcases clicked across the marble floor, while distant boarding announcements echoed overhead with practiced calm, creating the strange contrast of ordinary travel continuing around a moment that was quietly becoming anything but ordinary. "Ma'am, may we see your identification?" Collins asked politely enough, although the question already carried the weight of a conclusion rather than genuine curiosity. Naomi removed her military credentials without hesitation and placed them carefully into his waiting hand. Her movements remained slow and deliberate, the same disciplined composure that decades of leadership had taught her to maintain under pressure. Collins studied the identification card for several seconds. The photograph matched perfectly. The embedded security features appeared authentic. Even the expiration date was valid. Yet instead of easing his concern, every legitimate detail somehow strengthened his suspicion. He looked up at Naomi again, then back down at the rank displayed beneath her name. Brigadier General. The title seemed impossible to reconcile with the woman standing quietly before him in comfortable travel clothes carrying an ordinary suitcase. "Where is your escort?" Collins asked. "I requested privacy for this trip," Naomi answered. "I am visiting my mother." Collins exchanged a quick glance with Sullivan. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet neither officer allowed himself to consider that possibility for very long. Experience had taught them to notice inconsistencies. Confidence had taught them to trust themselves more than anyone else. A small government sedan remained parked outside the terminal entrance, its driver checking his watch again before looking toward the sliding doors. Inside, the young Army private who had spoken with Naomi earlier noticed the conversation becoming more serious. He hesitated only briefly before walking closer. "Officer," he said respectfully, "I believe she is expected for military transportation." Collins raised one hand before the private could continue. "Thank you, soldier. We will handle this." The private immediately fell silent, uncertain whether speaking again would help or make matters worse. Naomi looked toward him with a reassuring smile so subtle that almost nobody else noticed it. She did not want a young service member risking disciplinary questions over a misunderstanding involving someone far senior to him. Collins returned his attention to the identification card. "Do you have any additional documentation proving your assignment?" Naomi nodded. "Everything you need is already linked through the Defense Department verification system. If you contact the operations office at the Pentagon, they can confirm my identity within minutes." Collins folded the identification holder closed without making the suggested call. "Anyone can claim to know someone in Washington," he replied. "That does not make the claim true." Naomi remained completely still. The bustling terminal seemed louder now as conversations blended with rolling luggage and boarding announcements. Yet an invisible circle of silence had begun forming around the small group. Curious travelers slowed their pace. Several people discreetly reached for their phones, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Sullivan quietly spoke into his radio, while Collins continued examining Naomi with growing skepticism. Neither officer noticed the military driver outside stepping out of the waiting sedan and scanning the terminal entrance with increasing concern after realizing the passenger he had been assigned to escort had still not appeared. Inside the airport, every minute carried the situation one step farther from a simple misunderstanding and one step closer to consequences that none of them could yet see approaching. Naomi understood the moment had stopped being about her almost as quickly as she noticed the frightened expression on the young private's face. He shifted his weight uneasily, his hands tightening around the strap of his duffel bag as though every instinct told him to speak again, even while military discipline warned him to remain silent. She knew that look. She had seen it on countless young service members standing at the beginning of careers that could be shaped by a single decision. Before Collins could ask another question, Naomi turned her attention toward the private instead of herself. "Soldier," she said gently, "you have already done your duty today. Please continue to your assignment. Do not involve yourself any further." The young man hesitated. "Ma'am, I can explain who you are." Naomi offered a calm smile that carried neither frustration nor fear. "No, you have orders to follow, and I will not have you questioned because of me." Her words landed softly, yet they carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to leading thousands without ever raising her voice. The private swallowed hard before giving a respectful nod. He stepped backward, although he did not leave completely. Instead, he remained near the boarding gate, unable to stop watching. Collins observed the exchange with growing suspicion. "Interesting," he remarked. "You certainly know how to sound convincing." Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Leadership is not measured by how loudly someone speaks, officer. It is measured by how well they protect the people around them." Collins dismissed the comment with a faint shake of his head. Sullivan had already finished another radio call and quietly informed his partner that no immediate verification had come through local databases. That answer only reinforced what Collins already believed. Around them, the circle of curious onlookers continued to grow. Business travelers slowed their pace. Families waiting for departures whispered among themselves. Several passengers discreetly lifted their phones, recording what appeared to be another unexpected confrontation inside a busy airport. Nobody knew the full story, yet opinions began forming with remarkable speed. Naomi noticed every camera without reacting to a single one. She had spent decades learning that public judgment often arrived long before public understanding. Outside the terminal, the government sedan remained parked beneath the afternoon sun. The military driver stepped away from the vehicle and attempted to contact his operations office after failing once again to reach the distinguished passenger he had been assigned to escort. His concern deepened with every unanswered minute. Inside, Collins held Naomi's identification one final time before placing it into an evidence envelope. "Until we establish exactly who you are," he said evenly, "we will need you to accompany us." Naomi slowly nodded. I will cooperate completely. The answer surprised several people standing nearby. There was no argument, no raised voice, no attempt to prove herself through anger. She simply adjusted the strap of her carry-on suitcase with her free hand and glanced briefly toward the airport windows where sunlight reflected across the glass like liquid gold. For a fleeting moment, she thought about her mother waiting at the rehabilitation center, probably smiling at the nurses while wondering whether her daughter had landed safely. Naomi quietly whispered, almost to herself, I promised I would be there before dinner. Collins heard the words, but misunderstood them entirely. To him, they sounded like the ordinary concern of someone whose plans had been interrupted. He never imagined that within the hour, the interruption would reach far beyond a missed family visit and begin changing the lives of everyone standing in that terminal. Collins gestured toward a quiet security corridor that branched away from the busy terminal, and Naomi walked beside him without resistance, her carry-on suitcase rolling smoothly behind her with every measured step. Sergeant Sullivan remained a few feet behind, while speaking softly into his radio, requesting additional administrative support even though the situation remained calm. The polished hallway reflected the bright ceiling lights, and every footstep echoed against the clean walls with remarkable clarity. Behind them, the crowd did not immediately disperse. Instead, more travelers paused, and several recordings that had begun only moments earlier were already finding their way onto social media. The captions appeared almost instantly. Some claimed an impersonator had been caught inside the airport. Others insisted the officers were preventing a security threat. Very few questioned whether the full story had been told. Inside the comments, strangers who had never met Naomi Brooks confidently debated who she was and what she must have done. The speed of judgment surprised no one who had ever witnessed the internet at work. As they reached the security office, Collins politely asked Naomi to place her belongings on a nearby inspection table. She complied without hesitation, carefully setting down her handbag, folding her blazer across the edge of the table, and placing her identification holder beside it. Everything was neat. Everything was orderly. There was nothing hurried or defensive in her movements. A civilian airport supervisor entered the room carrying a clipboard after hearing reports of an unusual situation involving military credentials. He looked first at Collins, then at Naomi, then at the identification card resting on the table. Has anyone contacted the Defense Department Verification Office? He asked. Collins answered confidently. We are handling the investigation through normal procedures. The supervisor nodded uncertainly, but did not press the matter. He assumed the officers had already exhausted every appropriate option. Naomi quietly spoke for the first time in several minutes. Sir, if you would simply place one telephone call to the Pentagon operations desk, this misunderstanding could end before it grows larger. Collins folded his arms. You have repeated that several times. Because it remains the fastest way to establish the truth, Naomi replied. Her voice never changed. It remained calm enough that even the supervisor found himself studying her expression more carefully. There was no desperation, no anger, only quiet confidence. Outside the office, the young Army private still lingered near the boarding gate, unable to convince himself to leave. He finally approached the military transportation driver who had entered the terminal searching for his missing passenger. The private explained everything he had witnessed from the beginning. The driver's expression changed immediately. Did you say Brigadier General Naomi Brooks? He asked. The private nodded. Without another word, the driver removed a secure government phone from his jacket and stepped toward a quieter corner of the terminal. His fingers moved quickly across the keypad before the call connected. Meanwhile, inside the security office, Collins removed Naomi's phone from the evidence envelope after it vibrated once again. The screen displayed another incoming government number with a secure federal identifier. Sullivan glanced at the display. Probably another verification attempt, he remarked. Collins stared at the phone for a brief moment before silencing the call without answering. Naomi watched the screen go dark, then slowly lifted her eyes toward him. There was no accusation in her expression, only disappointment so deep that it seemed to fill the silent room. Somewhere beyond the office walls, a secure line had already reached the Pentagon duty desk, and for the first time that afternoon, someone with direct knowledge of Brigadier General Naomi Brooks had just learned that she had disappeared before arriving at her scheduled military pickup. Silence settled over the security office with a strange heaviness after the phone stopped vibrating. The fluorescent lights reflected softly across the polished table where Naomi's identification, neatly folded blazer, and small leather handbag rested exactly where she had placed them. Nothing in the room appeared chaotic, yet something invisible had begun to change. Naomi sat quietly in the chair near the window, her posture straight, her breathing slow and even. She did not argue. She did not demand special treatment. She simply watched the late afternoon sunlight stretch across the floor as another airplane lifted into the clear blue sky beyond the glass. The sound of its engines faded gradually until only the distant hum of the airport remained. For the first time since the questioning began, Sergeant Sullivan found himself studying Naomi instead of the paperwork. He had interviewed countless travelers over the years. Nervous people tapped their feet. Angry people interrupted. Deceptive people often talked too much. Naomi did none of those things. She sat with the quiet patience of someone who had spent an entire lifetime making difficult decisions while everyone else waited for instructions. Across the room, the civilian supervisor looked once more at the military credentials lying on the table. The security features were unmistakably authentic. The photograph matched perfectly. Even the official seals appeared exactly as they should. He cleared his throat. "Officer Collins," he said carefully, "would it really hurt to verify the identification through the Defense Department? It seems like the simplest solution." Collins remained convinced that procedure required patience rather than outside interference. "If the documents are legitimate, the system will eventually confirm them," he answered. "If they are not, we will know that too." Naomi slowly turned toward him. Her voice remained remarkably gentle. "Sometimes the fastest path to the truth is simply asking the right person." Collins did not respond. Instead, he glanced toward the quiet phone resting inside the evidence envelope. Outside the office, life continued almost normally. Families hurried toward departure gates. Children laughed as they pulled colorful rolling suitcases behind them. Fresh coffee drifted through the terminal from a nearby cafe, mixing with the clean scent of polished floors and conditioned air. Yet only a few hundred feet away, the military transportation driver stood beside a large window speaking into his secure government phone. His calm professional tone had disappeared. "Yes, sir," he said. "I am absolutely certain." Brigadier General Naomi Brooks never arrived at the pickup location. Airport security has detained her after questioning her credentials. There was a long pause. The driver's expression slowly changed. He straightened instinctively. "Understood, sir. I will remain here." The call ended. Thousands of miles of secure communications quietly awakened in places the travelers around him could not see. Inside the Pentagon, names were being confirmed, schedules reviewed, and locations verified with increasing urgency. Back inside the security office, Naomi looked toward the fading sunlight one more time. She remembered sitting beside her father on the front porch many years earlier after returning home from her first difficult assignment. He had told her that character revealed itself most clearly when someone else held the power to misunderstand you. At the time, she had only partially understood his words. Sitting there now, surrounded by uncertainty yet refusing to surrender her dignity, she finally appreciated every lesson he had ever tried to teach. None of the people inside the room realized that the quiet they were experiencing was only the brief pause before an answer began traveling toward them from the highest levels of military command. The silence inside the security office shattered not with shouting, but with the sharp ring of the office landline. Every head turned at once. The civilian supervisor instinctively reached for the receiver before looking toward Collins, who gave a brief nod of approval. "Airport security operations," the supervisor answered. His professional expression remained unchanged for only a second. Then the color slowly drained from his face. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "She is here." A pause followed. The room became so still that the distant rumble of another departing aircraft seemed unusually loud through the reinforced windows. "Understood," the supervisor continued. Immediately, he slowly lowered the receiver without speaking. Collins frowned. "Who was that?" The supervisor swallowed before answering. "The Office of the Secretary of Defense." Collins stared at him for a moment, expecting clarification that never came. Before anyone could ask another question, every phone inside the office seemed to come alive almost simultaneously. Sullivan's radio crackled with overlapping voices requesting his immediate status. Collins's department phone vibrated repeatedly with incoming calls from command staff. Even the supervisor's desk phone rang again before the first conversation had fully settled into silence. Outside the office, movement spread rapidly through the terminal. Several men and women in dark business attire entered through a secured access door, each wearing federal identification credentials. They walked with calm purpose rather than urgency, yet something about their composure caused nearby airport employees to step aside without being asked. The military transportation driver spotted them immediately and straightened his posture. Behind them, two senior military officers in service uniforms entered the terminal, accompanied by additional personnel who quietly began speaking with airport administrators. Travelers looked up from their phones. Conversations faded into whispers. Nobody fully understood what was happening, but everyone sensed that the situation had suddenly become far more significant than anyone had first imagined. Inside the office, Collins answered his ringing phone. Officer Collins speaking. He listened for only a few seconds before his confident expression began to unravel. Yes, Captain. I understand. No, sir. Yes, sir. He lowered the phone slowly, his eyes drifting toward Naomi. For the first time since approaching her in the terminal, uncertainty replaced certainty. Another knock came at the office door. It opened almost immediately. A distinguished Air Force lieutenant general stepped inside, his perfectly pressed uniform decorated with ribbons earned over decades of distinguished service. Every military member present instinctively stood at attention. The lieutenant general looked directly at Naomi before offering a respectful nod. General Brooks, he said warmly, I sincerely apologize for the delay. We have been looking for you. Naomi rose calmly from her chair. She returned the greeting with quiet professionalism, showing no satisfaction, no anger, and no triumph. Only dignity. The lieutenant general then turned toward the officers. His expression remained composed, but his voice carried unmistakable authority. Brigadier General Naomi Brooks serves as one of the Department of Defense's senior strategic commanders. She was expected at a classified briefing less than 1 hour from now. The words settled over the room with extraordinary weight. Collins felt every assumption he had made only minutes earlier collapse beneath the undeniable truth. Sullivan lowered his eyes. The civilian supervisor stood speechless. Beyond the office walls, more federal officials continued arriving, while throughout the terminal the story already spreading across countless phones had begun changing from speculation into stunned disbelief. Naomi quietly picked up her neatly folded blazer from the table, and without saying a single word about what had happened, she gently brushed an invisible speck of dust from the sleeve before placing it back over her arm. No one moved for several long seconds. The office, so full of certainty only moments before, now felt strangely small beneath the quiet authority that had entered with the lieutenant general. Officer Ethan Collins looked at the identification card resting on the table as though he were seeing it for the very first time. Every detail he had dismissed now seemed painfully obvious. The official seals, the security markings, the name, the rank. Nothing had changed except his willingness to believe what had been in front of him from the beginning. Sergeant Mark Sullivan slowly removed the evidence envelope containing Naomi's phone and identification. His hands, steady through countless routine investigations, now carried an unfamiliar hesitation. He carefully placed both items back onto the polished table before stepping backward. General Brooks, he said quietly, your personal belongings. Naomi accepted them with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the afternoon. She slipped her phone into her handbag, folded her identification into its leather holder, and placed the strap gently over her shoulder. There was no dramatic gesture, no visible satisfaction. She simply restored her belongings as though finishing an ordinary day at work. The lieutenant general watched her with visible respect before turning toward Collins and Sullivan. Neither officer could meet his eyes for very long. Outside the office, the growing crowd had become almost silent. Many of the travelers who had recorded the earlier encounter now watched through the glass wall, realizing they had witnessed something far different from what they had first assumed. Several quietly lowered their phones. Others exchanged embarrassed glances after remembering the conclusions they had rushed to post online only minutes earlier. Collins finally found the courage to speak. General Brooks, he began, his voice noticeably softer than before, I owe you an apology. Naomi looked at him without hostility. She waited patiently, allowing him the dignity of finishing his own words. I made assumptions that I should not have made, Collins continued. I failed to verify the facts when you repeatedly offered a way to do so. I am deeply sorry for how this situation unfolded. The room remained silent after he finished. Naomi studied his face for a brief moment before answering. Officer, every person carries authority in some form. A uniform does not create character. It simply reveals it. Collins lowered his head. Those words carried far more weight than any formal reprimand ever could. Naomi continued gently. The greatest danger is not making a mistake. Every human being makes mistakes. The greatest danger is believing we already know enough to stop listening. Even the civilian supervisor felt those words settle heavily across the room. They were not spoken with anger. They were offered almost like a lesson from a trusted teacher. The lieutenant general nodded quietly, understanding exactly why thousands of service members respected the woman standing beside him. She had spent an entire career leading without humiliating those who failed. Collins took a slow breath before speaking again. Is there anything I can do to make this right? Naomi looked toward the large airport windows where the late afternoon sun painted long bands of golden light across the terminal floor. She smiled faintly before answering. Yes, the next time someone asks you to verify the truth, let the facts speak before your assumptions do. You may never know whose life, whose family, or whose dignity depends on that decision. Her words lingered long after the room fell silent again, and for everyone standing there, the lesson would remain far longer than the embarrassment of that unforgettable afternoon. 3 months later, the first cool breeze of autumn drifted across the parade grounds at Fort Myer, carrying the familiar sound of flags moving gently against their poles. The morning sunlight settled across rows of service members gathered for a leadership symposium unlike any the installation had hosted before. Military officers stood beside federal law enforcement representatives, airport security supervisors, and newly promoted recruits, all invited to participate in a program focused on judgment, professionalism, and public trust. At the front of the auditorium, a simple podium stood beneath a large American flag. There were no dramatic decorations, no oversized banners, only a quiet reminder that leadership was measured by responsibility rather than appearance. Officer Ethan Collins sat several rows from the front wearing a plain business suit instead of his former airport uniform. Weeks of internal reviews and mandatory retraining had changed far more than his daily routine. The confidence that once answered every question before it was asked had been replaced by something quieter and far more valuable: humility. He looked around the room before lowering his eyes to the notebook resting on his lap. Written across the top of the first page were 6 simple words. Verify first. Assume nothing. Listen completely. The audience rose together as Brigadier General Naomi Brooks entered the room. She wore her service dress uniform with quiet dignity, every ribbon and insignia reflecting decades of sacrifice that no civilian clothing could ever have revealed on that afternoon at the airport. Yet nothing about her expression suggested triumph. She greeted every person she passed with the same calm smile, whether they wore stars on their shoulders or sat in the back row taking notes. When she reached the podium, the room became completely still. Naomi allowed the silence to settle before speaking. The strongest leaders are not the ones who never make mistakes, she began. They are the ones who are willing to recognize them before those mistakes become someone else's burden. Her voice carried easily across the auditorium without ever becoming loud. She never mentioned names. She never described the airport. She never pointed toward anyone in the audience. Instead, she spoke about dignity, patience, and the quiet responsibility every person carries when another human being places trust in their judgment. Collins listened without looking away. Every sentence felt less like criticism and more like an opportunity he had almost lost forever. When the presentation ended, the audience responded with a long standing ovation. As people slowly began leaving the auditorium, Collins waited until the room had nearly emptied before walking toward the stage. He stopped a respectful distance away. General Brooks, he said softly, I wanted to thank you. You could have remembered me for my worst decision. Instead, you gave me the chance to become someone better. Naomi smiled with the same kindness she had shown from the beginning. That chance belonged to you, she replied. You simply chose to accept it. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched across the parade grounds as service members returned to their duties. A gentle breeze lifted the edge of the American flag above the building, and for a long moment Naomi stood watching it move against the clear blue sky. Then she quietly turned, stepped into the waiting vehicle that would carry her to visit her mother at last, and the door closed softly behind her. The engine started. The vehicle rolled forward. The flag continued to wave in the sunlight, and in the peaceful silence that followed, it was not power that remained. It was character.